And can I, on a personal basis, and I think also on behalf of the Education Committee, place on record our sincere appreciation to the work that the research does here at the Assembly, and in particular, and it's no disrespect to Mark being with us today, but to Caroline, who does an exemplary job for us at the Education Committee and produces for us very useful and very valuable research papers that inform us as to a variety of issues. And those research papers are available on the Education Committee's website. So I welcome you today here as Chair of the Education Committee, and it has been a daunting task. I always say to people that my party leader and the First Minister must have had a moment of weakness, because on the same day that he appointed Sammy Wilson as the Minister for the Environment, he appointed me as Chairman of the Education Committee. And that sent various sectors into various issues of concern. However, I have endeavoured since taking up that post to ensure that I engage with the sectors, to ensure that I am as well informed of the issues that are out there in terms of education. And there is no doubt that one of them that has been placed fairly and squarely on the education or on the political map is the issue of shared education. The seminar is of particular interest to the Education Committee, and given the commitments within the programme for government for 2011 to 15 to ensure that all children have the opportunity to participate in shared programmes, and to the sustainability and the increase of the number of schools sharing by 2015. In addition, the recent and forthcoming area plans for post-primary and primary provision raise questions around how these commitments will be actually put into practice. Research in Northern Ireland would indicate that a majority of schools have engaged in some form of collaboration with other institutions, for example, through the sharing curriculum facilities, the joint purchasing of equipment. However, many of the current collaborations are thought to be largely embryonic in nature. It's from research such as we are considering today from Colin and Vani that we gain new evidence to help us in exploring the potential benefits and challenges in regards to shared education. That is why I am glad to welcome them both today here to this event at Stormont, and thank them for the work that they have done and the conversations, particularly with Colin, that we've had in the past in regards to this issue. Now, that's what's on my official script that I was told to say. And now, as most people know, I always set scripts aside, just to say that I think that there is a challenge for us in regards to the issue of shared education on a variety of fronts. I think the political process is being dragged to the issue at various levels and in various ways, and I probably am as critical of all the parties, so I'm not going to pick out any individual in regards to this. However, it was, and I would have to say this just in case the First Minister and my party leader gets a copy of the video and plays it, that it was Peter Robinson who did, I believe, very clearly and very distinctly put the issue of shared education again back onto the political agenda in terms of Northern Ireland. I think that we will have challenges when we come to look at the ESA bill around how will we see reflected in the ESA bill or not reflected in the ESA bill the issue of shared education. But as I said to Colin and Vani prior to the commencement of this event today, I think that one of the largest challenges that we have is the issue of area plans. I know that there's representatives from the department here, so I'll be as cautious as I always am whenever I'm commenting about the actions and activities of the department. Area plans have been basically akin to taking the pin out of a hand grenade and throwing it under a school and hoping that everything's going to work out all right. Because there are real challenges now being placed in schools. Schools are now being forced into a situation as to their existence. where they will be as a school in the weeks and months and years ahead. And I know, and I see some in the audience today, particularly from Fermanagh, who have done a huge amount of work in bringing schools to a better place as far as the discussion and the debate around shared education. There are many schools who, and as far as I can see, that debate hasn't begun in earnest and with a real intent. In my own town, the town of Ballymoney, which I live in, which I represent and am proud to in this assembly, there are discussions around what the future provision of education will be. And that is an interesting discussion that is going on. And I think that it has to be handled in a way which is respectful, a way which is reflective of the ethos and identity of the schools that are having those discussions. So I think that there needs to be a continuing and ongoing debate, but there needs to be more than that. There needs to be substance, and there needs to be meat placed on the shared education skeleton. And I think that events like today help in terms of that process, and certainly the report that has been carried out and the work that has been carried out by Colin and Vani will make an invaluable contribution. And as I already, and I can say this publicly, we look forward to both Colin and Vani coming to the Education Committee during our scrutiny of the ESA bill and to others, because I want to ensure that this informed piece of legislation will be informed, and it will be informed not just by those who believe that they have a right to inform the process, but it will be informed by those who have, I believe, an absolute right in terms of making sure that all aspects of our education provision and the changes that we are proposing in the ESA legislation are listened to, heard and taken account of. And so I'm delighted to be here. I do apologise that I won't be able to stay until the conclusion, but I have said that I'm quite happy before I go, if there are any particular questions that people want to ask, any criticisms, comments, other than chairs being thrown, I'm quite happy to stay and to take part. But I do trust that you have an enjoyable afternoon and that you find this not just to be an afternoon that you've enjoyed, but also that it has been informative and worthwhile. Thank you very much.
In this short-ish presentation, we're going to divide the topic into three broad categories here. First of all, I'm going to set out some of the challenges facing the education system in Northern Ireland and some current government proposals to change the system. Secondly, Vani's going to question some of the assumptions which underpin those reforms. And thirdly, I'll come back and talk a little bit about how we think shared education might offer an alternative to improving education outcomes. So, to the challenges for education, the first thing to say is that Minister O'Dowd set out a very challenging agenda for education in the policy statement, Putting Pupils First, in September 2001, Shaping Our Future. In that statement, he said that he felt the pattern of provision in terms of schooling is both unsustainable educationally and financially. And he noted that there was some 85,000 spare places, the equivalent of 150 excess schools, out of a total school population of about 320,000 pupils. In addition, the Department of Education is clearly coming under significant pressure in terms of budget cuts. From its £2 billion budget over the next £2 billion yearly budget over the next 4 to 5 years, it has to make cuts beginning at about 100 million in the first year of that spending round, right up to about 290 million in the last year of that financial cycle. So, in addition to the challenges which were set out by the Minister, I think the most recent Education and Training Inspectorate report notes the challenges ahead very explicitly. The ETI report set out its policy aim as promoting improvement in the interest of all learners, and my colleague Vani will come back to the all learners bit shortly. But I just want to pick out two out of three themes that the Education Inspector referred to. The two themes are, firstly, achieving value, and the second one, transforming communities. In terms of achieving value, and one of the issues around inequalities in our education system is a focus perhaps here on free school meal pupils. And the Chief Education Inspector noted there's very low level of achievement within free school meal pupils, and there's a widening gap in outcomes, both of which are unacceptable in our system. And again, to quote her, she said, there are too many children are failing to fulfil their potential. And she cited that although pupils were getting, some pupils were getting 5 or more GCSEs at A star to C with English and Maths, that percentage had actually increased from 52.4% in 2006-07 to 59.5% in 2011-12 is the good news part of that. The bad news part is that only 32% of those are free school meal children. And indeed, the target for increase in achievement in that free school meals category is almost 50% in the programme for government targets. Interestingly as well, the Chief Inspector said that there was a need to improve the quality of leadership and management across all of those sectors. To the second theme that she highlighted in her report was about transforming communities. And here again, she drew attention to the need to close the achievement gap. All schools need to work as a united community across controlled, integrated, maintained Irish sectors to improve standards and outcomes for all learners. And she quoted, more cohesive planning and closer collaboration are required to serve the best interest of learners. So she called for an inclusive learning environment. The problem with that in Northern Ireland is that our education system is hugely segregated. If you look, for instance, at these three columns, they show on the left-hand side the mix of attendees, community background attendees at the controlled sector, maintained sector, and the integrated sector. On the top right-hand bar, you will see that there's only approximately 5.4% of Catholics who actually attend controlled primary schools. If you look at the second bar at the bottom, you will see that there's only 1% of Protestants attend maintained primary schools. And the pattern repeats itself across each of our school types. So this is the same chart: controlled schools, maintained schools, integrated schools. And again, if you look at the top right-hand bar, you will see that for secondary non-grammar schools, there's only about 2% of Catholics attend controlled non-grammar schools. If you look at the bottom of the second bar here on the maintained sector, there's less than 1% Protestants attend maintained non-grammar schools. The pattern is slightly different, marginally different if one looks at grammar schools. Again, if you look at the left-hand bar at the top, you will see that there's about 8% of Catholics actually attend the controlled grammar schools, whereas down here in terms of the voluntary Catholic schools, you will see that there's only about 0.9% of Protestants attend Catholic voluntary grammar schools. So we'll see our system is highly segregated. The overall picture is that Catholics are much more willing to go to schools in the controlled sector than Protestants. Equally, there's a greater movement by Catholics into the grammar controlled sector to access what they would see as high quality education from that sector. So in summary, we think that there are three challenges facing our education system here. First of all, education outcomes are much too variable. Secondly, there are significant access and performance inequalities in our schooling system. And thirdly, there clearly is, as I've just outlined, a high level of segregation there, particularly at a time when our executive are trying to promote cohesion, sharing and integration. So quickly, what are the proposals for reform coming forward from government here? Well, underpinning this process of reform is the principle set out by the department, which is to ensure that every learner fulfills his or her potential at each stage of development. The proposals coming forward from the Department of Education was that the Minister commissioned the 5 education and library boards, working with CCMS and other sectors, to conduct viability audits of all primary and post-primary school. And those viability audits looked at 3 key elements: the quality of education experience, usually judged by exam results, enrolment trends, and the financial standing of schools. As a consequence of those viability audits, they were used to develop strategic plans leading to a network of viable and sustainable schools. In other words, each of the 5 education and library boards had to produce a plan showing that they had the right number of schools of the right size, located in the right place, and having a focus on raising standards. They were also advised to try and use this process to drive up education standards and address social needs in those schools that were drawing particularly from socially deprived areas. In keeping with these reform proposals, the educational library boards and CCMS and other sectors were asked to promote principles of equality and good relations throughout the process. And finally, to be consistent in their area planning process with policies, the policies of the Department of Education. And that included things like sustainable schools policy, every school a good school, and their community relations, equality and diversity policy, sometimes referred to as CRED. So what has been the progress to date? Because the consultation process ended on Friday last. Well, guidance in that process from the department to the boards included the fact that they should consider realistic, innovative and creative solutions. And the question Vani and I pose here is, where are they? Because evidence from the draft area plans do not really suggest to us a serious commitment to this advice. First of all, from our analysis of the plans, we see no focus on raising education standards. Rather, they are about increasing school size above arbitrary thresholds and meeting a needs-based model on the future of enrolments. That needs-based model has resulted in essentially 2 separate planning processes taking place here, one led by the education and library boards and one led by CCMS. We have referred to this as cut and paste consultation documents. The area plans, we feel, fail to address 3 problems in our post-primary education system, namely variable education outcomes, inequality and segregation, those things which characterise the system which we currently have. So we want to look at, my colleague Vani will look at some of the underpinning assumptions around this reform agenda. And we feel that some of the factors which are driving this reform agenda are the excess supply of schools, this notion of 85,000 empty desks, the need to save money, and a trend towards larger schools. I'm sure those assertions of ours would be contested by the Department of Education and perhaps the Minister. So, in our view, these the proposals so far fail to address access and performance inequalities, and to actually understand, they fail to understand, in our view, the factors which actually drive school performance. Can this institutional response through area learning, these area plans actually raise education standards? In other words, this move to large urban-based single identity schools. The area plans themselves exclude a number of key criteria which are at the core of school improvements. So, for example, they don't include references to links to the community. They don't include factors like accessibility to schools, very important in rural areas. And very importantly, the area plans don't make any reference to school leadership and management, all of which they say we can't do these because they can't be measured. But if you look at the Sustainable Schools policy, they have indicators as to how these things could be measured at the back of the document. So how, we ask, can these area plans be consistent with Department of Education policy if many of the key criteria are actually missing from them? Another question that we have is whether the area learning communities that are cited as a way to lift education standards, what is the evidence that they actually do that? Certainly, there's some evidence that they will help to deliver the entitlement framework, but where's the direct link to raising education standards here? And finally, in terms of some of the inequalities which Vani cited, how do they actually promote equality of opportunity and good relations? So we ask, is the Department of Education actually missing an opportunity under the Northern Ireland 1998 Section 75 to promote good relations, a statutory duty of the department and the educational library boards? And in fact, its own community relations, equity and diversity policy, CRED, and I quote, is there to encourage greater sharing and collaboration across and between all education sectors on a cross-community basis. So against those questions, we, I think, have hopefully some fundamental things to say to the department, but also to offer, by way of some constructive advice, things that we think could be improved. What else should be considered? Well, this evidence around, or this request to the boards and CCMS to consider realistic, innovative and creative solutions may be considered and include options that increase sharing in education and infrastructure in line with the Department of Education commitments to the programme for government, which Mervyn referred to in his opening remarks. So we think that these area plans, despite guidance from the department to the boards and CCMS, have gone very light touch on shared education to date, and that's confined to work through the area learning communities, through extended schools initiatives, through their CRED policy, and through actually a reliance on external funders, not the department, not the boards, not CCMS, to deliver some of this change. So our suggestion here is we think there should be change. And because of the title of the seminar, not too surprisingly, we think shared education might offer positive and constructive ways to do this. So what is shared education? And I think there's lots of confusion around this. One definition that is used is that shared education refers to schools from different sectors working together in a sustained process, ranging from 2 or more schools making shared use of specialist facilities, through to coordinated timetabling and pupils taking classes across a network of schools. Now, shared education is different from integrated education, which involves, if you like, the removal of sectoral differentiation in favour of unitary common schools. Another definition, a much wider definition than the one that's been used so far, is the definition that's used by the Ministerial Advisory Group, which has been just been set up on shared education. I'm not going to go through all of the detail, although that is their specific definition here, but it looks at much wider, casts much wider the range of sharing here to include all Section 75 categories, all socioeconomic status, all providers, all sectors, identity and ethos, and finally to deliver education benefits to learners. So there's a much wider definition being used by the Ministerial Advisory Group on sharing. And I think it is about, their definition is about improving education, it's about value for money, it's about addressing inequalities, it's about addressing good relations. So they see shared education not just cross-community, if you like, maintain control schools, but they see cross-sectoral opportunities here, grammar to secondary to integrated to Irish medium. They see intra and inter-community sharing here, and a particular emphasis on promoting equality and good relations. So very quickly, if I can just give you a quick and dirty overview of the origins of shared education. And Tony Gallagher and Richardson and Gallagher in their recent book have covered this in much more detail. But there are three basic initiatives here, three different sources, if you like, which has influenced the evolution of shared education. The first one is curriculum initiatives, things like Education for Mutual Understanding and Cultural Heritage, which were programs developed and supported by the department. The evidence is that these were accorded fairly low priority by teachers. There was an attempt also through devising joint curriculums around history and religious education to find new ways of delivering more inclusive education. Teachers felt that they were unwilling to tackle some of the very controversial issues associated with these curriculum initiatives. Secondly, there were contact schemes, and these were essentially cross-community contact schemes that funded initiatives, tended to be one-off initiatives, and they tended to have limited value because of lack of consistency of contact. And finally, integrated schools, which have made an enormous contribution here since 1981 through the establishment of Lagan College. I think there's about 61 of those integrated schools now, 20 post-primary and 41 primary. But Richardson and Gallagher claim that although there is evidence that those schools actually contribute to more distinctive approaches in terms of identity and attitudes, that there is also evidence that that these schools, integrated schools, have weak systemic links, and that they lack a common vision in terms of what integration should mean and how it should be realised. I can already feel heat from the integrated sector across the room there. So, as a result of some of those perceived limitations, if you like, of those initiatives, we have moved towards a system which is encouraging collaboration and networks across the schools. That has been prompted by two factors in particular. One is the revised curriculum and the entitlement framework, which does require schools to collaborate if they're to fulfil their statutory commitments soon on offering that full range of subjects. And importantly, the Bain report, influential report in my view, that talked about the need for collaboration and sharing to fulfil an education case, which was that pupils could access a full curriculum choice, high quality teaching and good facilities. A societal case for collaboration and sharing that was about promoting tolerance, mutual understanding and regular engagement through interaction and learning. And my colleague in Queen's, Joanne Hughes, has done a lot of work on that. And the economic case, which was that there should be cost-effective provision as a consequence of collaboration flowing from shared schools. So, where did all of this go, this incentive to greater collaboration? Well, it resulted by and large in terms of external funders seeing some appeal around this agenda of collaboration. So there was a feeling that schools would move from this model currently of competition between schools and isolation, if you like, between each other to one of collaboration centred on the needs of the learner within this collaborative network. And the two funders which, if you like, stepped up to the mark here were Atlantic Philanthropies and the International Fund for Ireland, who currently support a shared education programme. More about that in a moment. But they did see themselves very much as risk takers here, doing things that perhaps the department felt might have been difficult for them to do at that point in time. So how does it all work? Well, the focus is really on delivering core curriculum activities through shared classes. It's a 4-stage process. It's about establishing partnerships between schools. It's about building collaborative links. It's about shared classes and activities, leading on to the promotion of economic, education and reconciliation benefits. So it is important to understand that this isn't about threatening schools' identity or ethos. It's not about trying to create a kind of hybrid of Catholic and Protestant, what we've termed a prodelic. It's not about that. In practical terms, the outworking of this model is being done since 2007 by 3 projects, one located in the School of Education in Queen's, one by the Fermanagh Trust, and one located in the North Eastern Education and Library Board, a project entitled Primary Integrating Enriching Education. Currently, there's over 150 schools involved in shared education. There's about 44 collaborative partnerships, and there's about 11,000 pupils involved in this on a weekly basis. How does it work? It's 3 elements. It's about delivering shared education. The priority here is about increasing the number of shared classes that sustain pupil-to-pupil relationships. It's about supporting teacher development to deliver shared education. And it's about ensuring organisational learning and inter-community collaboration amongst partner schools. So the process supports school staff to manage change through mentoring and joint events. Just by way of a few very quick examples here, I've chosen 3, one from each of these projects. The first one is about enhancing qualification framework. This is a project that the School of Education do, and I'm going to give you an example that's perhaps a little dated here from the first phase of their work. 6 schools in the Maherfelt area, 2 maintained, 2 controlled, 1 integrated and 1 special education needs school. They provide support for all of their Year 13 pupils to prepare them for 3rd level education. There are 29 different shared subjects and courses offered to their Year 13 pupils on a weekly basis. And that's done through a mix of twilight classes and embedding these subjects in the school timetable. And that has been a very successful project. In terms of rural primary schools, the example that I'm going to give you is 2 adjoining rural primary schools in Fermanagh, in Tempo in County Fermanagh, controlled school and maintained school. They came together to enhance the education experience for pupils and teachers through collaborating with one another around curriculum issues. So every pupil in those 2 schools, coming to about 200 pupils, engaged in shared classes in drama, art, design, health-related issues, science, English, and so on. So the subjects were contributing to pupils' development within the Northern Ireland curriculum. And that had a hugely positive impact on parents in that area, given the legacy of conflict in the border areas around Fermanagh. And the third and final example, which I think is a very interesting one, is that 2 primary schools in the North Eastern Education and Library Board, a controlled and maintained school, who by themselves would not have met the Bean criteria, work together to develop key stage 2 education opportunities through things like literacy, numeracy, personal development and mutual understanding. Such was the success of this programme that they now actually employ a shared teacher who was appointed by a joint board of governors. In some ways, the creativity here kind of outstrips our potential to cope with this within our current statutory system. Just to say that shared education has achieved a significant level of party support. Mervyn mentioned the fact that clearly the Peter Robinson statement was significant in terms of his desire to see a single education system. The current Minister of Education has made very positive comments towards shared education. And in short, we think shared education has become part of the lexicon for reform here in education. We also argue that it does actually align with DE policies. The DE strategic objective on performance includes closing the performance gap and increasing access and equity. It's consistent with Programme for Government Commitments, to which Mervyn referred. It's also consistent with the Department's CRED, Community Relations, Equity and Diversity Policy, and with, more generally, cohesion, sharing and integration within CSI. So, to move towards conclusion, what are we suggesting here as an alternative to some of the large schools, large urban-based single identity schools? Well, we think that to move shared education from the margins to the mainstream is possible here. And we have looked at some research in England, and colleagues in Queen's have been very helpful in this as well. And the research evidence is that through collaborative networking, where we have more effective schools paired off with less effective schools, it does help to improve their education performance. And there, as I say, there's a body of literature on that. And this is particularly true where leadership is strong within those schools and it's supportive of the network itself. So where there's a number of where the number of schools involved is limited here, that also helps in terms of working the network, and where they've got access to external support if need be. So our suggestion really is to incentivize this peer learning approach through revising the common funding formula. The schools at the moment, as you know, are in competition with one another. We think that the funding formula needs to change to encourage this kind of collaborative action. So our suggestion really is that the rising tide here of peer learning will lift every school's education boat. Research, again, from the GB context tells us that when you're involved in peer learning, you should concentrate on, not too surprisingly, generating positive relationships, focusing on teaching and learning, understanding, leading and managing changes, committing to continuous professional development, building community support for this and drawing on external support. So in summary, we propose 3 or 4 things. First of all, we think that we can use the model of shared education as a vehicle for peer learning. Secondly, we think that schools involved in this process should be what we have described, along with colleagues at Queen's, as educationally proximate and geographically proximate, so close in terms of their education performance, close in terms of their geography, so that we're not incurring huge transportation costs. We think that there should be, this focus on peer learning should include these elements that we know from research elsewhere makes it much more effective. We could build in cross-community support as a condition for peer learning, but we think that this will probably happen by default because those schools which are in competition with each other are likely to be within the one sector. And finally, we think that these plans for shared education should be incentivised, as I said, through the revised funding formula. So, just 2 quick conclusions. Our view is that this 2-tier system emerging from area plans will result in largely single identity, what we have described as we're all right schools, mainly grammar schools, and for the remainder there will be a scramble to close, to rationalise and to amalgamate. Whereas we think the first group and higher achieving secondary schools could become peer learners. And we think the second group could explore shared education options. In short, we think we should move away from this one-size-fits-all large urban school approaches. Finally, we think the opportunities now exist to embed shared education through the Salisbury review of the Common Funding Formula, through the Ministerial Advisory Group on Sharing, and through the ESA, the Education and Skills Authority Bill, which is going through the Assembly at the moment. Shared education, in our view, offers the following kind of opportunities. It offers the opportunity to improve education outcomes, to address access and performance inequalities, and to improve community relations. Thank you for listening.